So today is Scotiabank Hockey Day in Canada on CBC and Sportsnet. Now, every Canadian NHL team is in action across the country, and as families get together to watch their favorite team in action, there are a few stories from minor to university hockey that we want to talk about. So last Sunday, an argument broke out at a Pee-wee hockey game in Simcoe, Ontario, and police initially were called in to investigate a physical fight involving 30 adults. Turns out it wasn't a physical fight, but words were exchanged. It was a heated argument. And just days before that, in North Bay, Ontario, police were also called to a game in to break up a couple of parents again from an argument. But they had calmed down once police arrived. No charges were laid in either of those two incidents. Then we go over into Wolfville, Nova Scotia. 15 university players were suspended for this incident, this brawl on the ice, a bench-clearing hockey brawl between St. Francis Xavier and Acadia. Now, it spilled over onto a team's bench after a player insulted another. All right, so this raises some questions about Canada's national sport concerning what does and does not cross the line when it comes to parental and player behavior. And what are the underlying issues within hockey culture that perhaps need to be addressed? So to talk more about this is Sean Gerald is joining us, and he's the managing editor of The Athletic Toronto. And he's also a hockey dad and minor hockey volunteer. Thank you for joining us here in studio.
Thanks for having me.
And also Theresa Bailey is the president of Centre Hastings Minor Hockey League Association. And she's also a blogger at CanadianHockeyMoms.ca. And she joins us from Madoc, Ontario. Hello, Theresa.
Hi there.
All right, so Theresa, we're going to start with you. We'll give you the first question here. You've been involved in minor hockey for a few years now with 3 kids playing the game. So when you hear stories of police being called in to break up arguments between not the players but the parents, how big of a problem are parents at games?
I think that it happens. It's been happening for years. It's not necessarily something new. It happens more often, I think, at this time of year as people are fighting for playoff spots or in series where they're seeing each other more often. And emotions boil over and it becomes an issue sometimes, but not that often.
Okay, now, Sean, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and you had a somewhat of a similar opinion, and you're actually coming straight here from hockey practice, aren't you?
Came straight here from coaching the mighty East York Bulldogs. I sure did.
Okay, so what's your take on all of this? I mean, from an outsider's perspective, I'm not a hockey parent. I did not play hockey as a youth, so I'm not really all that involved in it, although I'm a spectator, no question. Is this getting worse, or is this something that's just happened all the time? Do you see it?
I think, to the point, it's late in the season, so parents have been in these arenas drinking terrible arena coffee for months on end, and it is easy to lose perspective. It's easy for us to sit here and say, look at them, they're losing their minds, but in the game, it is easy to lose perspective. That doesn't make it right. But you see shoots of, these sprouts of problems growing up all over the place that, even at our age, at, 7-year-old hockey, the parent who might yell at the referee over a tripping penalty, the kid is 7 years old. I think that as you go on, like these build up incrementally. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but I think that's the root of it.
All right, so if you're saying it certainly does happen, maybe Theresa, I'll go back to you just for a question on what sort of rules exist surrounding policing this type of behavior that then doesn't actually involve police?
Well, it starts from an early age, and associations are required to have codes of conduct that they put in place in the OMHA anyway, and most other association or leagues, where you have a code of conduct there whereby if there's an infraction, there's a method for disciplining players or coaches or parents. And there are rules set out for how you behave, and there are rules set out for consequences of those things. So there are things in place to help guide and monitor behavior.
So would you say then that people are following these guidelines and rules, or do they not really, even though they probably are telling their kids to follow guidelines and rules?
Certainly not in the clips you just showed.
Right.
Yeah, I think those are still generally outliers. I think most parents are fine, but it gets intense. And I think that one thing that every hockey parent has to keep in mind is that the race isn't to get your child to the NHL. The race isn't to get your child a scholarship in the NCAA. You win the race if your child reaches the teenage years, when they typically drop out of organized sports and they love hockey. So to foster the love of hockey is the game itself and not the outcome, which is what you're seeing here, where they're fixated on the outcome and little Jimmy and little Johnny's not getting the right call, so they lose their minds. And that's them losing perspective of the bigger picture.
And I mean, being a fan, of course, people know that these things at games, you can get passionate and feelings can be intense when you're watching, especially if it is your own child on the ice. So I'm wondering, Theresa, in your capacity, again, as president of the Minor Hockey League Association, have you had to actually talk to parents before and say, your behavior is out of line here?
Absolutely. I don't think that there is an executive on an association around that hasn't had to, at some point, address something with some parent. It happens in different degrees. It happens at different times of the year. It usually happens with the same parent more than once, which is why you end up having to address it as an executive. And those parents where there are issues, it's a small percentage or degree, and it does happen, and it's something that as an executive we don't like doing, and it's kind of why we have the codes of conduct in place to help us put a process in so that we can deal with it.
And so, Sean, now let's move from the behavior of parents to the behavior of players. And no doubt parents are role models for their children and set an example. So perhaps in some cases, if you're watching your parents argue over the game, and you would do the same thing if you're on the ice. But we saw this extraordinary case in Nova Scotia where the two teams got into this brawl. There's more than a dozen suspensions that were handed out, including the coaches for that matter. Do you think the chirping, as they call it, is getting out of hand?
I mean, chirping has been in the game for a long, long time. I mean, some people call it an art. I mean, maybe there's a bit of a science to it as well. I think...
And chirping, of course, is taunting the opposite team.
Taunting, and again, it has a broad definition. It can cross the line quite often. I think some of the reports out of Nova Scotia suggest that it did cross the line there, and that the reaction was, I don't want to say justified, but certainly an aggressive taunt merits an aggressive action, an aggressive response. I think that what happened in Nova Scotia is very different from what we're talking about in terms of the parents reacting. I think that, again, in Nova Scotia is an outlier, because generally in the culture of hockey now, getting away from the movie Slapshot, where you fire up the ambulance to get the crowd and the bloodlust, it's leaving the game. They don't fight that much in the NHL. There are significant penalties if you fight now in junior hockey. I think at the top levels, that notion of what hockey culture is ebbing away, and that I think that what you're seeing now is increasingly outlier behavior.
And Theresa, I'll just ask the very final question to you then. In terms of the hockey culture, we heard from Sean that he believes it's somewhat changing. Do you think that parents are noticing that it's changing, or have people sort of been a lot more tentative in putting their kids into hockey clubs?
I think that there are definitely some people who are tentative to put their kids in clubs, absolutely. But there are lots of families who are just as passionate about it as they used to be. And when it comes to taunting, I think that the culture itself has really, or associations are really trying to get rid of all of those. It's a 7-game suspension if you use homophobic or racial slurs. 7 games a child can get at any age for using that kind of language. So the culture itself is really being cleaned up. I think there's efforts to do that, and I think that there are just always going to be people who are really excited about or get really impassioned about hockey, and it boils over into the stands or on the ice.
Well, it is a hot topic for certain. So thank you, Sean. Thank you, Theresa, for this discussion today. Sean Fitzgerald is the managing editor of The Athletic Toronto, and he's also a hockey dad and minor hockey volunteer. And Theresa Bailey is the president of Centre Hastings Minor Hockey League Association, and she's also a blogger at CanadianHockeyMoms.ca. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.